In this video, we're going to talk about factoring polynomials, and we're going to focus specifically on binomials, and then in a later video, we'll get to trinomials and a little bit more difficult problems. But for this video, let's just focus on binomials. And so whenever we are factoring binomials, so remember, binomials means there's two terms, right? There's two things we really have to look for, okay? First, we are looking at the coefficients, all right, meaning the numbers in front of the variables. So we have to get the greatest common factor of the coefficients. But with polynomials, we also have to look at the variables, okay? So those are the two things we're looking at. So most of you probably already know what greatest common factor and factoring is, right? But it gets a little bit different whenever we're talking about polynomials. So let's dive into an example. So let's say that we have the binomial 3x squared plus 6x. And so we want to factor this binomial by getting the greatest common factor out of those two terms. Okay, so in order to really help you understand, we're going to write out both of these terms in expanded form and then let you see kind of what the process is. So 3x squared in expanded form. So 3 cannot be expanded anymore. 3 is the greatest common factor of 3. But our x squared can be expanded out into x times x, right? Because x times x is x squared. And so we could say that 3x squared is the same thing as 3 times x times x. With our other term, our positive 6 can be broken out into 3 times 2. And then we just have one x. We don't have x squared, so we're just going to write times x. So now we have both of our terms expanded out. And so we're going to look at what can we factor out of both terms, okay? So right away, I see that we can take out a 3 from both terms, and we can take out 1x from both terms. Okay, now our second term only has 1x, so we can't take out another one. So that means that we have a greatest common factor of 3x. So all right, GCF, greatest common factor. And if on a test you were asked to factor this binomial by greatest common factor, well, you have your greatest common factor now, 3x, and then you would put in parentheses whatever is left over. So in this case, you would have x, and then you would have 2. So x plus 2. Okay, and a good way to double check ourselves is to now work backwards, and we're going to distribute our 3x to both terms to make sure that we still get this same binomial of 3x squared plus 6x. And so if we do that, 3x times x is 3x squared, and then 3x times 2 is plus 6x. And so we get the same thing, and so we know that we did it correctly. Okay, so that is how you factor a binomial or any polynomial by greatest common factor. Okay, so let's look at a couple more examples just to make sure that we have this down. All right, so let's do the problem 32x squared plus 12x. So we want to factor out the greatest common factor, and we're going to get to an answer with our greatest common factor, and then we're going to have parentheses for the rest of our answer, okay? So first of all, I'm not going to expand it out this time. Let's think about what number can I factor out of 32 and 12, all right? So I'm thinking, okay, I could factor out a 2, And I could factor out a 4 because 4 times 8 is 32. 4 times 3 is 12. Let's see. Could I do 8 times 4 is 32, but 8 won't go into 12. Okay, so I'm thinking that my greatest common factor of 32 and 12 is going to be 4. Okay, and then whenever we look at x squared and x, all right, what can we take out or factor out of both x squared and x? Okay, and so just like the last problem, we can take out one of those x's. Okay, the second term, again, only has one x, so that kind of limits how much we can take out. So our greatest common factor is 4x. Okay, and then from there, we're going to write in the rest of our expression in our parentheses. All right, so 4x times what would get us back to 32x squared? Well, obviously 4 times 8 is 32. And then x times what is x squared? Well, obviously itself, x times x is x squared. So we're going to put an x right there. All right, for the next term, we're going to go ahead and put a plus because we know that this is a positive. So 4 times what is 12? 4 times 3. Okay? And then x times what will give us x? Well, x times 1 will give us x. So we're not going to put a 1 in parentheses here. There's no need to put times 1. We're just going to leave the 3 by itself. And so this would be our answer. Okay, so again, whenever you see a binomial or a polynomial and it says factor it out by greatest common factor, or if you just don't know or don't see another way to factor it, then this would be what you would do. You would factor out your greatest common factor, which in this case was 4x, and then you write the rest of your expression in the parentheses. Okay, and so you just try to think, we want to make sure that both of these expressions are equal to each other. Okay, so that's a good way to check if you did it correct. All right, and let's do one more problem before we wrap up. So let's do 8x squared minus 40x minus 16. Okay, so this time we are doing a trinomial, but we're still going to factor it out by greatest common factor. Okay, so let's think about what can we factor out of each one of these terms. Okay, let's think. We could definitely factor out a 2. They're all even numbers. All right, let's see. 4 would go into 8. 4 would go into 40. 4 would go into 16. Okay, that's a good option. Let's see. Obviously, 8 would go into 8. 8 times 5 is 40. And 8 times 2 is 16. Okay, so I'm thinking that 8 is going to be the greatest common factor as far as the coefficients go for sure. So I'm going to take an 8 and put it right there. Now, obviously, we could take out an x from the first two terms, right? But this last term, we cannot take an x out of because it doesn't have an x. It's just a number, okay? So 8 is actually going to be our greatest common factor. And then from here, we're just going to complete the expression in parentheses, okay? So 8 times what would get us to 8x squared? Well, obviously, we're just going to write x squared because 8 times x squared would be 8x squared. Okay, next term. 8 times what would give us negative 40x? So 8 times negative 5 would get us to negative 40. And then if we just need, and then we need to have that x in our term, so we're just going to put x. And then lastly, 8 times what would get us to negative 16, and that would be negative 2 or minus 2. And so we would close our parentheses, and that would be our answer, okay? So again, 8 is your greatest common factor, okay? And again, if you just want to double check, you could go back through and distribute 8 to each of these terms and just make sure that both of these expressions are equal. Because although we're factoring and changing the look of the expressions should still be equal. Okay? So I hope this video was helpful, and we will see you next time.